Guys, this month's book is Polio, An American Story by David M. Oshinsky. The subtitle is The Crusade That Mobilized the Nation Against the 20th Century's Most Feared Disease. A book that came out in 2005, and it's about 300 pages long. I read this book twice, or maybe three times, and I just don't remember one of them. And it is a part of the triumvirate of my all-time favorite books. I love reading this one, which is why I've done it more than once. Ironically, in November of 2019, I was reading some news stories and looking at areas that were international, and people started talking about some sort of virus that was going around in China and how it was really bothering medical experts, and a lot of references to SARS. Made me want to read this book. I finished whichever one that I was on at the time. By January of 2019-2020, I start reading this one again, and of course, it became COVID, a global pandemic. What's so funny about that to me isn't the irony of the timing, as much as this book really gave me an appreciation for something very specific that wound up happening as a result of the COVID pandemic that really lines up with this book and the story about polio. So let's talk about what this book covers. You get some really cool information, I think it's cool, that I just didn't know. I've heard of the phrase March of Dimes. I knew it was some sort of charitable organization. Had no idea what they did, never looked up, never got involved with that particular charity, had no idea that it was related at all to former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or that it was kind of one of his big political pushes, and he had a lot of those, so it's easy to get lost in there. That history was really helpful to understand the way that this societal mobilization to fight a disease was worked out early on. And there was a lot of people who were scared. The subtitle saying that this was the 20th century's most feared disease is really interesting, because what's so important is, why did it get that status? And there's really two reasons why. First and foremost, the general, I don't want to say target, but the general susceptible individual was a child. And of course, we're very protective of children, rightfully so. And we would probably have, quote unquote, ignored it more if it were more of an adult-oriented disease than if it were a children's disease. The thing that really freaked people out, though, was the demographics of the families that were stricken by polio. Most of the time, when there is a rampant disease, you're going to find those in the poorer areas, because there's going to be less valid nutrition. There's going to be a cleanliness and general health community difference. Except that's not who was suffering under polio. It was middle-class families. It was quote-unquote clean homes. These were the people who were targeted, which led to actually a really big theory for a while there that polio must have been something that all these children were getting exposed to for the most part, but the heightened hygienic practices of the middle class meant that their immune systems weren't built up in a way that they could fight off polio from here or there, which it's just fascinating when a disease is targeting those who you don't expect it to target. Whereas comparing it with COVID, what did you hear? Immunocompromised elderly children, that all makes sense. You're going to get a lot of Jonas Salk, and I'm suddenly forgetting the first name of the other scientist, Sabin, and a lot about their competition, essentially, in the race to come up with a vaccine that will take care of the polio problem. This is actually the meat of the book, and it's the part where I say I got an appreciation for something. So when I say that, here's what I mean. It is fascinating to, pre-COVID, have read this book and saw what was so different about Salk's approach and Sabin's approach. And the answer has to do with the virus that they were putting inside the general cocktail of the vaccine in question. Salk had theorized, and he wasn't the only one, just talking about the two big names here, there were plenty of other people involved in this. But the Salk vaccine basically said, you're going to get a better immune response from a live virus vaccine than you would a dead virus vaccine. And Sabin was saying, that may or may not be true. Who cares? You've got to make millions upon millions of these vaccines. You've got to have quality control. And even with the best quality control, there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be errors. And a live virus vaccine is going to actually, instead of protecting people from polio, it's going to give them polio. So he said, let's stick with how we've done vaccines mostly up to this point, which is kill the virus, let the body recognize it, and have some immune response. In the end, both vaccines were successful, and it followed through with exactly what people thought. Some people did, in fact, get polio from the vaccine because of quality control issues. But at the same time, the vast majority did not have those issues, and the ones who got the live virus vaccine did have better results because of it. Why I bring this up in the case of COVID is because the COVID vaccine, at least some of them, because there were multiples, are so interesting in that we don't actually have to ask this question anymore. A century later, less than a century later, we basically concocted a vaccine that mimicked the virus without actually having to have the virus in it. So this major ethical, scientific fight that had so many different directions it could go, and how reasonable both sides' arguments were on this matter, don't matter anymore. We were just able to advance beyond that. And I just think that's something that, unfortunately, the weird politicization of COVID means that it'll be a long time, I think, before we ever actually have a society that recognizes we did something really cool this century that's going to change the way that vaccines are done going into the future, that literally took away a massive risk. Did it introduce a new risk of some sort? Sure. I'm guessing there's going to be quality control issues with synthetic viruses as well, and it's probably going to look mostly the same to us as they did before. But the fact is, it's something we were able to do, and I just think that's amazing. So I can go on about this book, and as you can tell, I'm trying to talk a little fast so I don't make this too long. Criticisms. There's one particular criticism that is very common regarding this book, and I will say I skipped all the critiques of this book, COVID and post-COVID, because I have a feeling I know exactly what those criticisms are going to be. A lot of people say that the scientific writing in this book is pretty poor, and they point out that there's a focus on history and politics. Yet again, this is an example of what people are actually critiquing is they misunderstood what the book was going to be out. Let's read the title and the subtitle again. Polio, an American Story. Polio wasn't just a disease that impacted the United States. So right off the bat, I'm assuming people who are going to want to pick this book up knew that. Especially if they're so into science, they knew it wasn't just one nation that had to deal with this particular virus. So that's the first clue. This isn't a science writing book. But then the subtitle says, The Crusade That Mobilized the Nation. Mobilize the nation. You know what scientists are bad at? They're really bad at communication. Scientists don't mobilize anybody. It sucks. I wish they did or could. I think they should. I've said it before. I think that Wheaties boxes shouldn't have professional athletes on the cover. They should have scientists on the cover, because we don't recognize very well what's really important versus what's just a fun aside. But the book's title was really clear, to me at least, what kind of story this was going to be. So I think the criticisms about poor science writing could be accurate, but that's not why you should be picking up this book. It's about the politics and the history of polio. And I also want to ding one guy on Amazon who left a bad review. I'm not going to say their username or anything. You can find them if you're curious. But they didn't like the book, and they also said they didn't win the Pulitzer in 2006. Well, for one, Pulitzer is many prizes given out every year. And in fact, this book was one of the winning ones. It's actually how I came across this book. I saw that it won it, and I added it to my list as something I wanted to check out. So it's just interesting, people who complain that they don't think the book is as factual as it needs to be. They can't even critique the book factually. This is a great book if you want to know the history and politics of a specific rampant disease that had a lot of political implications, and that actually really did address for decades how viral diseases would be approached from a preventative standpoint. It's a recommendation to you if you want to check it out and it fits in your particular milieu. I said that word wrong. That's fine. I'm moving on now. Bye, guys.